All right, take two. Welcome to Mr. K is Wrong, where I look at the Facebook posts of somebody I used to know and I debunk his bullcrap. I call him Mr. K because his last name does start with the letter K. And all right, so this time the meme that he shared on Facebook is as stupid as usual. It says, "It's not hard to create a peaceful society. You just need to jail criminals and stop importing barbarians." And the meme also has Benny Johnson involved. He's a right wing, uh, I guess, media person, if you want to call it that. And he says, it's that simple, so the memes sound simple on purpose, and that's really one of the first rats to be smelled with right wing supposed solutions to problems, is they usually try to come up with something that could easily fit on a bumper sticker slogan or something like that. And this meme reduces complex social problems to a slogan: jail criminals, exclude outsiders, and that equals peace. But when you look at real world evidence, especially under Donald Trump and his allies, it falls apart pretty quickly. So let's look at it in plain terms. So, first off, the just jail criminals thing is a little bit ironic and rich, because Trump has let powerful allies go unjailed. And of course, who's the most powerful ally that Trump has? Well, in a way, himself. He has been charged with crimes and convicted for crimes. Remember that? So remember, the claim assumes the system actually punishes criminals consistently across the board. It doesn't. That's sort of the fine print here. Trump himself was found guilty of 34 felony counts in a hush money case back in 2024. So long ago, all those 2 years ago. And at the same time, his use of presidential power often has gone in the opposite direction of holding people accountable for criminal activity. He pardoned or commuted sentences for political allies like Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and Michael Flynn, and those are all well documented cases. In his second term, Trump has granted clemency to over 1,800 criminals, and a significant portion of these actions involve individuals convicted of white collar crimes and public corruption, leading to widespread criticism from watchdog groups and legal experts who argue that the process is being used to reward political allies and wealthy donors. Corruption, in other words, which itself is, kind of a criminal thing. So let's look at some of these controversial pardons here. There were mass pardons for January 6th participants. Remember that? Trump issued a blanket pardon to approximately 1,500 individuals charged or convicted for their roles in the January 6th U.S. Capitol attack back in 2021. And what about some current politicians? Well, he's granted clemency to at least 20 politicians convicted of corruption related charges, including former Illinois Governor Rod Big Boy Blagojevich. I call him Rod Big Boy Blagojevich because he looks a lot like the mascot for the Big Boy restaurant. Or at least he did in his younger days. Now that he's got like white hair, now that he's older, he doesn't look as much like him. But if you look at the younger photos of Blagojevich, you'll see the similarity between him and the Big Boy. But anyway, there's also the former Representative George Santos, who was a cartoonish scamster. I mean, that's basically all he will be known for, is just being a cartoonish liar and fraudster, just all kinds of lies, all kinds of fraud schemes, and he got pardoned by Trump. Gee, I wonder why. And there was also Texas Representative Henry Cuellar. You know, it's a bit of a myth that Trump doesn't like any Democrats because he'll like you if you're corrupt and or evil. You know, if you can be essentially put into Trump's pocket in a way like that, if he'll do something like that to create loyalty and put you in a vulnerable position, well, then, you know what? He might even sing your praises in public at a certain point. Then there are the wealthy fraudsters and donors. Over half of his 88 individual second-term pardons through early 2026 went to wealthy criminals convicted of crimes like money laundering and fraud. So some notable examples include Paul Walczak. I might be pronouncing that correctly. I'm not sure. But anyway, he was pardoned after his mother donated $1 million to a Trump fundraiser. Gee, how could that be the case? It wouldn't be a way to get rich by pardons or anything like that. That's not what's on display there. Then there's Julio Herrera Valetuni. He was pardoned after his daughter donated $3.5 million to a Trump super PAC. Are you noticing a pattern here? Then there's Trevor Milton. He was pardoned after donating $1.8 million to pro Trump committees. And what about international figures? Trump is so well known for bashing foreigners. Well, pardons were granted to former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of drug trafficking. So keep that in mind with all his talk against drug traffickers and whatnot. Hernandez apparently trafficked in hundreds of tons of cocaine. If I remember correctly, it's like 400 tons. And, he was successfully convicted for that crime. But Trump was like, you know what? I'm giving you a pardon. How about that? So, what about Changpeng Zhao, who was a Binance founder, following business ties between his company and the Trump family's crypto venture? I guess he was a recipient of some special treatment there. And this has also impacted victims and restitution. The House Judiciary Committee Democrats highlighted that these pardons frequently include the remission of court ordered fines and restitution. So Trump is not only, giving these people giving these convicted people a second chance, but he's making sure that, they don't have to pay any further restitution. And Trump's pardons have wiped out nearly $2 billion in restitution and fines intended to repay victims and the government. So this is like restitution remission. In several cases, such as those of Devon Archer and Jason Galanis, the pardon warrants explicitly ended the requirement for the offenders to repay their victims, collectively totaling over $120 million for these two individuals alone. That's according to the Cato Institute. And to facilitate this pace, Trump appointed Ed Martin as the U.S. pardon attorney, and watchdogs like Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington note that Martin has largely bypassed traditional Department of Justice standards, such as the typical 5-year waiting period after sentence completion and the requirement for demonstrating remorse. So, research has shown his clemency decisions were frequently tied to political loyalty and, of course, money rather than consistent justice standards. So, this is not being done for any reason other than corruption and putting people in his pocket. So this isn't surprising. The state does not jail criminals neutrally. It protects insiders and punishes outsiders. If you're a rich person, you are significantly less likely to be branded a criminal or an outlaw. And that's not just true in the United States, but man, is it ever still true here? You can find this trend throughout history. And the meme that Mr. K posted ignores that power decides who counts as criminal in the first place. Things that the government does under Trump, like bombing a school or something, well, they can get away with that. But if you or I were to bomb a school, I'm not saying we should try to do it, but just hypothetically, if we bombed a school or something like that, we would end up in the slammer, right? And that seems a trifle bit unfair. It's almost like the position of the president or, a politician or a wealthy business elite. It's almost like that's a way to just get away with crimes. Like if you're a psychopath or a sadist or a murderer or whatever, any number of things, sexual crimes can apparently go unpunished as well. So crime and peace did not magically improve under hardline policies. In fact, the nature of these systemic crimes has just become more blatantly obvious. And if the meme were true, countries or administrations with harsher policing and anti immigrant policies would clearly be more peaceful. But that's not what has happened. The US under Trump still experiences mass shootings, political violence, and rising polarization. The most visible breakdown, well, one of the most visible breakdowns anyway, was the January 6th Capitol attack carried out by his own supporters, and many participants were later charged and convicted, which undercuts the idea that criminals are just external threats. Now, I mean, we know if we have brains that, not all foreigners are criminals and not all criminals are foreigners. We know that if we have functioning thoughts. But, if you're a person who is in the Trump cult, maybe your brain just doesn't work that well. I don't know. So let's look at something a little bit deeper here. There's state violence like policing, prisons, and militarization. You know, they're supposed to produce stability, but they often produce instability, not peace. They often escalate conflict instead of resolving underlying causes like inequality or alienation. All right, let's look at the other or another part of the meme, which says stop importing barbarians. That's obviously a propagandistic sort of statement right off the bat, and it's factually wrong and historically loaded. This part of the meme is both inaccurate and rooted in old xenophobic tropes, so of course Trump and Trump adjacent people love it. Immigrants in the U.S. are less likely to commit crimes than native born citizens, and this is a consistent finding across multiple studies. Courts have even cited Trump's rhetoric about immigrants as racially discriminatory, including statements describing non white immigrants in dehumanizing terms. Of course, one of the most famous examples by now is Trump saying in the presidential debate, no less, that people from Haiti are eating cats and dogs in Minnesota. Now, that should have been a disqualifying statement from Trump right away. He should no longer have had a snowball's chance in hell of becoming a president, but we're living in a nightmare right wing hellscape. So, I guess, dehumanizing people is all that it takes to get elected rather than something that's disqualifying. And the word barbarians itself has a long history. It's been used by empires to justify exclusion, conquest, and just violence in general. It's a classic tool of othering. Define a group as less than human, then justify harsh control. So what about the opposite? I mean, if we're going to throw around the word barbarian, what about how the United States is actually exporting barbarism in its policies abroad? The meme pretends violence is something that's only imported. In reality, US policy very often exports it. I mean, right as I speak, the United States is still engaging in its fresh war with Iran. And of course, you've got the support for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, destroying every school, every hospital, basically all of the civilian infrastructure, killing at least 100,000 people there and counting. So, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, including Trump, the U.S. has continued drone strikes and military interventions, as they are called, sometimes without any congressional backing. They've supported foreign governments accused of human rights abuses and expanded arms sales globally. So, this is key. States claim to provide peace at home while projecting violence outward, which then feeds instability, migration, and conflict. So they create the very same migration problem that they will, use to further uh, impose more violence. It's like a vicious cycle kind of thing, and that's a pretty regular pattern with right wing ideology. Their only way of dealing with any sort of issue, typically, I mean, with rare exception, it's to beat it, bomb it, shoot it, throw it in a prison cell, and deprive it of access to rights and resources and decision making. That is really the right wing ideology if you truly break it down to its most basic components. And going back to the Benny Johnson thing, remember this clown is the person who posted a meme of himself in AI form dressed as Batman beating up immigrants. So Benny Johnson isn't just sharing some edgy joke. His ideology is on display here, and that's a really gross thing about him. Like he has no real value other than just being a foul human being who posts trash online. Like, he's not going to actually ever say anything intelligent or well rounded. He's a partisan hack to the core. And of course, he also makes money doing that. So that's one of his main incentives as well. He's he's obviously making some pretty sweet cash by spreading his stupid propaganda online. And that's really, all you need to know about him. There's there's never going to be any intellectual core to any of his arguments or anything like that. He doesn't have any real interest in solving issues. In fact, if things get worse, he has more of a reason, more of an incentive to just, you know, stay online and keep posting his crappy views because, as things get worse, he's going to have more people to pick on and more money to get out of it because that is his bread and butter, so to speak. So keep in mind, he's also been fired for plagiarism and repeatedly criticized for spreading disinformation and misinformation as well. So, the plagiarism thing, all right, that's not the worst thing that he's done, but it was kind of a bad sign, right? That's a sign that he might not be the most trustworthy person. I mean, it's certainly not a good sign if you've been busted for that. But of course, his career after that is just a whole lot worse. He's also shared false or exaggerated claims and viral content, including misrepresenting events, and the AI generated image of himself as Batman beating up immigrants is really revealing. It frames violence as heroic if directed at a dehumanized group. It turns complex human issues like migration, poverty, and war into a disgusting and obviously kind of fascistic cartoon fight. And it normalizes the idea that vigilante violence equals justice, at least if that vigilante violence is directed at somebody who looks like an immigrant. So just a disgusting person. He's, like I said, he's got nothing of value. He'll never say anything even remotely intelligent in his entire career as a right wing propagandist. And, that's not accidental. It's propaganda logic. Simplify, dehumanize, then justify force. That's how fascistic ideology actually works. So the meme fails on every level. It's empirically false because harsh policies don't automatically create peace. In fact, they tend to create the exact opposite, and they tend to exacerbate problems that already existed, in addition to inventing many new ones. And it's politically inconsistent because Trump's allies, his powerful criminal pals, typically either go unpunished or he might pardon them. And it's morally loaded because it relies on dehumanizing language. It's ideologically revealing that it treats violence as a solution rather than as an unfortunate reality. You know, if these people had like conscience, I think they would more often feel guilty about the use of violence as a way to resolve issues. Because even somebody who's like pro-war, you might still be disgusted by that person, but at least in some cases, like historically, people will say, well, war should at least be a last resort or something like that. But as Trump has become increasingly normalized, you'll notice violence is now the knee-jerk go-to solution for nearly everything. And one of the biggest flaws in the meme's right-wing logic is this: it assumes hierarchy and coercion, like prisons, borders, and force in general, create order. In practice, those systems and approaches often exacerbate or outright create the very instability that they claim to solve. And that's why right wing ideology is bound to just make society worse.